1803. Think about that date for a second. Thomas Jefferson sits in the White House. The place is barely 3 years old at this point, and he signs a piece of paper that doubles the size of the United States. Overnight, the Louisiana Purchase. And here's the thing, nobody really knows what they just bought. Beyond the Mississippi River, and most Americans have never seen, the Mississippi River lies something so vast that the human mind struggles to comprehend it. We're talking about wilderness on a scale that makes modern national parks look like city parks. The Rocky Mountains rise up like a wall across the continent's spine, and behind that wall, valleys and streams and forests that have never, not once, seen a European face. And in those mountains, millions of beaver, not thousands, millions, building their dams, raising their families, living their beaver lives with no idea that across an ocean, European gentlemen have decided that beaver felt hats are the height of fashion, that a good beaver pelt hat marks you as a man of status and wealth, that there's a fortune to be made if anyone is crazy enough to go get those pelts. Street Louis becomes the launching point, this city perched at the edge of everything known. And from Street Louis, the fur companies start putting out the call. They need men, tough men, expendable men, men willing to walk into country where death isn't just possible, it's probable. The pay sounds incredible, $300 to $400 per year, plus equipment and supplies. Now, to understand how that sounded to the men hearing it, you need to understand what their alternatives looked like. You're a farmer's son in Kentucky or Ohio, and your future is a plow. Behind that plow for 50 years if you're lucky. You're a soldier drifting after the War of 1812. No job, no prospects, probably some trauma you don't have words for. You're a debtor with creditors breathing down your neck. You're a young man who feels like civilization is suffocating you, like there's got to be something more than this. And then someone tells you, go west, into the mountains. Freedom like you can't imagine. Make your fortune. Be your own man. So they go. Among the first are men whose names will echo through history, though most don't know it yet. Jedediah Smith shows up in 1822. He's unusual for this crowd, educated, deeply religious Methodist, carries a Bible everywhere. But Smith wants something. Unknown horizons. He'll find them all right. Jim Bridger signs on at 18 years old. Think about that. 18. An orphan working as a blacksmith's apprentice in street. Louis, and he hears about the mountains and thinks, yes, that. Whatever that is out there, that's where I need to be. Bridger will spend the next 60 years in those mountains, and they'll make him into something extraordinary. They'll also nearly destroy him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. John Colter now hears a name that matters. Colter goes west with Lewis and Clark, sees the Pacific Ocean, makes the round trip. And when the expedition heads back to Street, Louis and civilization, Colter gets to the edge of the frontier and thinks, no, not yet. He turns around, goes back into the wilderness, alone, completely alone, and he discovers what he'll call Colter's Hell, geysers, and hot springs in what we now call Yellowstone. He comes back and tells people about water shooting hundreds of feet into the air, and everyone thinks he's lost his mind. But he hasn't. He's just seen something no white American has ever seen before. These pioneers and hundreds like them, men whose names we'll never know, start transforming themselves. Because here's the thing that doesn't make it into the adventure stories. You can't survive out there as a civilized man. Civilization's rules don't work in the Rockies. Civilization's habits will kill you. So they learn. They learn to read weather in, cloud formations, and the behavior of animals. They learn to navigate by stars and landscape features. No maps, no compasses sometimes, just their eyes and their memory and their instinct. They learn to survive on raw buffalo liver when it's the only thing between them and starvation. They learn to sleep in snow caves when the temperature drops to 40 below zero. 40 below. That's cold that kills you if you make one mistake. One. They learn which routes keep scurvy at bay, how to set trap lines in streams so cold your fingers go numb in minutes, how to fight grizzly bears. And we're not talking about frightening them off. We're talking about actual combat with an animal that weighs 5 times what you weigh and can tear your head off. How to fight them with just a knife when your rifle misfires or you don't have time to reload. But more than any of that, they learn to live alone, months alone, sometimes an entire winter alone. Just you and the mountains and the howling wind and your thoughts. That kind of isolation does something to a person, changes them. Some men thrive in it. Some men go a little crazy. Most fall somewhere in between. And from the very beginning, I want you to catch this, because it's important. From the very first winter camps, alcohol flows through this new world, like a second river system. The fur companies pack it right alongside the traps and gunpowder, kegs of whiskey, barrels of rum, raw grain alcohol, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, William Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company. These are businessmen, smart businessmen, and they understand something fundamental about the men they're recruiting. These aren't normal men seeking normal lives. These are men running from something or toward something or both. Men who feel civilization pressing in on them, choking them. Men with demons. Men who need extremity to feel alive. And men like that drink. The first winter camps establish the pattern. Trappers gather at makeshift forts, temporary settlements, anywhere they can wait out the worst of the winter. And the bottles appear. The drinking starts as celebration. And why shouldn't it? You survived. Do you understand what that means? 50% half of first-year trappers don't make it. They die in ways that would give you nightmares. Grizzly bears maul men to pieces, leaving them in shreds if they're lucky, leaving them alive and suffering if they're not. Blackfoot war parties ambush trappers and take scalps. Flash floods sweep away entire camps. You're asleep 1 minute, drowning the next. Gangrene claims fingers and toes that freeze solid during those 40 below nights. Mountain fever, typhoid, probably, or some other disease we treat with antibiotics today, burns through bodies without warning. No doctors, no hospitals, just fever and delirium and death. So if you survive a season, yeah, you drink. You drink to celebrate survival. You drink to forget what you saw. You drink to quiet the nightmares about the grizzly that almost got you, or the cliff you almost fell off, or your partner who died screaming. Alcohol becomes medicine for wounds that aren't physical. And the companies watch this develop. They watch it with calculating eyes. William Ashley is particularly sharp about this. He's a businessman from Missouri, and he sees the opportunity. These men are isolated. They're addicted, or becoming addicted. They need supplies. And they can't just walk into town to get them, because there are no towns. Not for 1,000 miles. So Ashley develops the rendezvous system. Pure genius from a business standpoint, pure poison from a human standpoint. Instead of making trappers trek back to civilization every year, which wastes trapping time, he'll bring civilization to them. Every summer, supply caravans will haul goods up into the mountains. The trappers will bring their furs, they'll trade, everyone wins. Except that's not quite how it works. The first rendezvous happens in 1825. Henry's Fork, on the Green River. 29 trappers meet Ashley's supply train. These men have spent a year in the wilderness. A year of brutal labor, constant danger, isolation that would break most people. And they show up with beaver pelts, lots of them, worth thousands of dollars at Street Louis prices. And then they trade. Within days, sometimes within hours, most of that wealth evaporates. gunpowder, coffee, tobacco, sure. But also barrel after barrel of alcohol, and the trappers drink themselves into oblivion. They brawl, they gamble, they make promises they can't keep, they sign contracts they don't understand, and when it's over, when the rendezvous breaks up and they stumble back into the mountains, they're empty-handed. Worse than empty-handed, they're in debt. They owe the company money. The company that just bought their entire year's work for a fraction of its value. The company that sold them alcohol at markup rates that would make modern price gougers blush. And here's the brilliant, terrible part. Now they have to go back out, trap another year, because they're contractually bound, because they owe money, because they need next year's supplies to survive. The machine starts turning, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. It just grinds. Grinds men into profits while feeding them just enough hope and just enough alcohol to keep them coming back for more. This is how it begins. Not with heroic adventure, not with noble pioneers conquering wilderness, with vulnerable men, calculated exploitation, and addiction as a business model. The stage is set. The players are in position. And what happens next? The heights they'll reach and the depths they'll fall to will define a generation and leave ghosts in those mountains that linger even today. The late 1820s. If you're sitting in Street Louis watching the fur trade, you're watching what looks like a gold rush, except instead of gold, it's beaver pelts. And the numbers? The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of trappers pour into the Rockies. Not dozens anymore, hundreds. And they're finding beaver everywhere. Every stream, every creek, every river tributary. The colonies are building dams, raising families, doing what beaver do, completely unaware that they're about to become fashion accessories for European gentlemen. A skilled trapper, and we're talking about someone who really knows what he's doing, can harvest 80 to 100 pelts in a season. Spring trapping, fall trapping. Each pelt worth maybe $4 to $6 in Street Louis. Do the math. That's potentially $400, $500, $600 in a single year. For context, a farm laborer back east is making maybe $60, $70 annually. Plus room and board, sure, but still. The mathematics seems bulletproof. Work hard. Survive the dangers, and okay, the dangers are considerable. But you're tough, right? You can handle it. And wealth follows. Simple. Inevitable. Except it's not simple. And it's definitely not inevitable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me tell you about Jedediah Smith. Because Smith represents something important what mountain men could have been if things had gone differently. Smith arrives in the mountains, and he's different. Most trappers embrace the brutality, the wildness, the freedom from civilization's rules. They drink, they curse, they brawl, they take native wives, sometimes respectfully, sometimes not. They become something barely recognizable as the men who left Street Louis, not Smith. Smith carries his Methodist faith into the wilderness like armor. He doesn't drink at all, doesn't curse, reads his Bible by firelight every evening, treats native peoples with respect unusual for the time. You'd think this would make him weak, right? You'd think the other trappers would eat him alive. Except Smith is as tough as any man in the mountains, tougher than most. 1823. Smith's traveling with his party when a grizzly bear attacks him. And we're not talking about a close call, we're talking about the bear tearing half his scalp away, just rips it off. Smith's lying there, bleeding, dying probably, and he calmly instructs his companions to sew his scalp back on. Like he's giving directions to the nearest town. They do it. Crude frontier surgery with needle and thread. And within weeks, Smith is back to trapping. He leads expeditions that open entirely new territories. Discovers South Pass through the Rockies. This becomes crucial later for wagon trains heading west. Pioneers the route to California. becomes the first American to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains and return. His journals, and he keeps detailed journals, which also makes him unusual, reveal a man constantly wrestling with contradiction. Spiritual devotion versus violent survival. Christian principles versus frontier reality. In 1831, Comanches kill Smith on the Santa Fe Trail. He's 32 years old. One of the very few mountain men whose death doesn't involve alcohol. And here's what haunts me about Smith. He proved you could do it differently. You could survive, even thrive in the mountains without drinking yourself to death. But almost nobody follows his example. Almost nobody even tries. Now compare that to Jim Bridger. Bridger arrives as a teenager, 18 years old, and he grows into the mountains. Literally grows into them. They shape him like water shapes stone. In 1824, Bridger discovers the Great Salt Lake. He tastes the water, finds it salty, and legitimately thinks he's found the Pacific Ocean. He hasn't, obviously, but the fact that he's out there discovering major geographical features at age 20 tells you something about the kind of man he's becoming. Bridger learns to speak multiple native languages fluently. He can read landscapes like you and I read books, possesses this almost supernatural ability to navigate terrain he's never seen before. Ask Bridger how to get from point A to point B through unmapped wilderness, and he'll tell you, in detail. And he'll be right. But Bridger drinks, not as destructively as many, and that distinction matters, but he drinks, appreciates the escape alcohol provides after months of isolation and hypervigilance. And this makes Bridger important because he represents the middle ground, the functional alcoholic who accomplishes extraordinary things while carrying an addiction that would destroy most people. He's the bridge figure, no pun intended, between Smith's abstinence and the majority's descent into full-blown alcoholism. Now, let's talk about the rendezvous gatherings. Because by the early 1830s, these have evolved into something absolutely extraordinary, something part trading fair, part carnival, part apocalypse. Picture this. You're standing in Pierre's Hole that's near the Teton Range, some of the most spectacular mountain scenery on Earth. Or maybe you're in the Green River Valley, or Cache Valley. The location rotates, but the pattern stays the same. It's summer, the appointed time, and from every direction, trappers emerge from the wilderness. 500 men, 600, eventually 800 at the peak gatherings. They're buckskin-clad, leather-faced from sun and wind, leading pack animals piled high with pressed beaver pelts. These men have survived another year of predators and weather and isolation and danger that would break you or me in a week. Some arrive wealthy, relatively speaking. $3,000, $4,000 worth of pelts. A fortune. Others limp and empty-handed, lost everything to accidents, theft, bad luck, miscalculation, but they all arrive with the same desperate energy, the same need for human contact after months alone, the same hunger for supplies, for news, for women, for alcohol. And then you see Native American villages setting up, Shoshone, Flathead, Crow, sometimes Utes, hundreds of people bringing their own pelts, their own goods to trade. Native women in traditional dress, children running between lodges, warriors on horseback. It's a temporary city appearing in wilderness, a collision of cultures that exists nowhere else. Then, and this is when things really start happening, the Street Louis caravans arrive. Imagine being a trapper who hasn't seen manufactured goods in a year, haven't tasted coffee, haven't had tobacco, haven't seen cloth or mirrors or anything that reminds you civilization exists. And then over the horizon comes this train of pack mules and wagons carrying everything the wilderness lacks. Coffee, tobacco, sugar, gunpowder, lead for bullets, steel traps to replace the broken ones, cloth, ribbons for native women. This becomes important for trade relationships, beads, mirrors, and alcohol. Barrel after barrel after barrel of alcohol. The trading begins, and this is where the exploitation becomes visible if you know what to look for. Fur company representatives set up their operations. They use standardized values they've predetermined, and here's the key. They set these values. A beaver pelt equals approximately $1 in trade goods. That's the baseline. Everything's calculated from there. But those trade goods, they cost enormously more than they would in Street Louis. Coffee that costs 10 cents per pound in Missouri, and I want you to really hear this, sells for $2 at Rendezvous. That's a 2,000% markup. 2,000%. Tobacco jumps from 20 cents to $3 per pound. 1,500% markup. Gunpowder, traps, blankets, everything's inflated at rates designed to extract maximum value from trapped labor. And I use the term trapped labor deliberately, because that's what these men are, even if they don't realize it yet. But alcohol represents the highest markup and the highest demand. A gallon of whiskey costs the $1. Company 25 cents in Street Louis. They sell it for $5 at Rendezvous. That's a 2,000% profit right there. But it gets worse. They don't sell it by the gallon, they sell it by the pint. Further inflating costs. A trapper pays $1 for a pint of watered-down whiskey that cost the company less than 3 cents. 3 cents versus $1, and the trappers pay it. Gladly, desperately. The drinking begins immediately, and I mean immediately. The caravans aren't even fully unpacked before bottles start circulating, because these men have endured months of deprivation, months of hypervigilance, where one mistake equals death. Months of isolation that creates psychological pressure you and I can barely imagine. Now think about what happens when that pressure releases all at once. Within hours, not days, hours, Rendezvous transforms into something that has to be seen to be believed. Trappers drink until they can barely stand, then drink more. Gambling tents operate continuously. Card games, dice, betting on shooting contests, betting on horse races, betting on anything. Fortunes in pelts change hands over single card draws. A man wagers his entire year's harvest, 12 months of brutal labor on one hand of cards, and loses. Just loses. Everything. And then immediately signs a contract for next year's labor to cover his debts. Signs away his future because he's drunk and desperate, and the alternative is admitting complete defeat. Violence erupts constantly. You've got hundreds of heavily armed, half-drunk men who've been carrying grudges through months of isolation. Someone says something. Someone else takes offense. Knives come out. Fists fly. Fights escalate into brawls involving dozens of men. They shoot targets off each other's heads to prove marksmanship. Except sometimes, and this is where liquid courage becomes liquid, stupidity, sometimes the shooter misses. Thomas Fitzpatrick, remember that name, earns the nickname Broken Hand after shattering his hand in a shooting accident during a drunken Rendezvous celebration. His hand, not the target's hand, his own hand. The sexual dynamics add layers of complication I need you to understand. Many trappers have native wives, legitimate marriages creating real families. Shoshone women, Flathead women, Crow women partnering with white trappers for economic alliance, cultural exchange, genuine affection. These relationships bridge cultures. They create families that exist between worlds. But Rendezvous also brings exploitation. Trappers trade goods for temporary sexual access. Women navigate impossible dynamics between traditional values and economic opportunities. Jealousies ignite. Old relationships fracture. New alliances form, and all of this happens while alcohol loosens inhibitions and intensifies every emotion. Let me tell you about Jim Beckworth, because Beckworth's story reveals just how complex this world really is. Beckworth is born to an enslaved mother and white father. He's free. But Eastern America offers him what exactly? Racism. Limited opportunity. Constant reminders he doesn't fully belong. So Beckworth heads west, and in the mountains he becomes something extraordinary. He's a successful trapper first, good at the work, tough, skilled. But more importantly, the Crow people adopt him, not as a curiosity, not as a mascot, as a genuine tribal member. He learns to speak Crow fluently, takes multiple Crow wives according to their customs, eventually becomes a war chief, leading raids against Blackfoot enemies. When Beckworth appears at Rendezvous, he moves fluidly between native and white worlds, drinks heavily with trappers, shares stories, gambles, brawls, then disappears back into Crow villages where he lives as a tribal leader. He's proof that cultural hybridity is possible in mountain society, that you can exist between worlds if you're skilled enough, tough enough, adaptable enough. Years later, Beckworth dictates his autobiography. It captures the swagger, the violence, the cultural complexity of peak mountain man culture. It's exaggerated, wildly exaggerated in parts, but it's also revealing, because Beckworth understands something crucial. This moment won't last. This cultural collision, this freedom, this opportunity to be someone different than society says you should be, it's temporary. So he documents it before it vanishes. Now here's what the Rendezvous system creates, and I need you to see this clearly because it's the heart of everything that follows. A trapper spends a year in brutal conditions, constant danger, isolation that damages the psyche, physical labor that breaks the body. He harvests maybe 80 pelts, brings them to Rendezvous, trades them for supplies and alcohol, and when Rendezvous ends, he stumbles back into the mountains owing more than he earned, contractually bound to the fur company for another year, carrying enough supplies for immediate needs but little else. His entire year's work evaporated in weeks of drunken celebration, and the fur companies watch with satisfaction. William Sublette, Bill Williams, others running supply caravans calculate profits exceeding 300% on invested capital. 300%. The markup on alcohol alone generates enormous wealth. They've created a perfect system. Isolated trappers work desperately for months, produce valuable pelts, then trade everything for overpriced goods, with significant portions going to alcohol that ensures continued dependency and poor decision-making. It's brilliant, it's brutal, and it's about to get worse, because we haven't even reached the peak yet. We haven't talked about the Battle of Pierre's Hole, about old Bill Williams losing his mind in solitude, about Hugh Glass's legendary crawl, about the systematic devastation of native communities caught in this machine. The empire of pelts is rising. Fortunes are being made just not by the men doing the work. And the alcohol keeps flowing, binding these men to a cycle they can't escape. Even the ones who want to. 1832. Remember that year, because 1832 represents the absolute zenith of mountain man culture, the peak, the moment when everything that's been building the wealth, the violence, the cultural collision, the alcoholism reaches maximum intensity. The Rendezvous that summer takes place at Pierre's Hole. That's near the Teton Mountains, and if you've ever seen the Tetons, you know we're talking about some of the most spectacular landscape on Earth. Jagged peaks rising straight up from valley floors, snow-capped even in summer, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small and alive and terrified all at once. 800 trappers converge on Pierre's Hole. 800. Plus hundreds of Native Americans from multiple tribes. We're talking about a temporary city of over 1,000 people appearing in wilderness, and everyone's carrying weapons, and everyone's ready to drink, and everyone's wound tight from months of isolation and danger. The beaver pelts stack in massive piles. We're talking tens of thousands of pelts representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential value. The whiskey barrels roll off the Street Louis caravans. Everything's in place for the usual pattern: trading, drinking, gambling, fighting, reconciliation, more drinking. And then something happens that changes everything. A large band of Gros Ventre warriors appears near the rendezvous site. Now, the Gros Ventre, their name means big belly in French, though they call themselves something else aligned with the Blackfoot Confederacy. And the Blackfoot are feared, legitimately feared. They've been fighting trappers and their native allies for years, taking scalps, killing anyone who enters their territory, defending their lands against invasion that threatens their entire way of life. So, when Gros Ventre warriors show up near a gathering of 800 trappers and their Flathead and Shoshone allies, tensions don't just run high, they explode. The question that matters, and nobody will ever answer this definitively, is what the Gros Ventre intended. Did they come to trade? Despite their alliance with the Blackfoot, did they want to participate in this economic bonanza? Or did they come for war? To strike at their enemies while they're gathered in one place, vulnerable, many of them already drunk? We don't know. We'll never know. Because before anyone can figure out intentions, a confrontation erupts. Shots fired. Someone on one side or the other pulls a trigger. Men fall dead. And suddenly we're not at a trading fair anymore. We're at war. What follows is the Battle of Pierre's Hole, the largest pitched battle of the entire fur trade era. And I need you to understand the scale here. This isn't a skirmish. This isn't a dozen men shooting at each other. This is hundreds of trappers and their native allies attacking a fortified position defended by Gros Ventre warriors who know they're fighting for their lives. The Gros Ventre dig in. They find a makeshift fort, fallen timber, natural defenses, and they fortify it as best they can. And then they wait, because they're outnumbered, dramatically outnumbered. But they're also warriors who've trained for this their entire lives. The trappers attack, wave after wave. And here's the detail that matters, the detail that reveals everything about what mountain man culture has become. Many of these trappers are drunk, not slightly buzzed, drunk, roaring drunk. Because the rendezvous has been going for days at this point, and drinking is continuous, and now suddenly they're charging into combat with alcohol-impaired judgment and liquid courage overriding survival instinct. The fighting rages for hours. Bullets and arrows fill the air. Men scream. Men die. Blood soaks into the valley floor. The Gros Ventre hold their position through sheer skill and desperation. The trappers keep charging through sheer numbers and recklessness. When the sun sets, both sides count heavy losses. The trappers claim victory. The Gros Ventre manage to slip away during the night, carrying their wounded. But the trappers bury multiple dead, experienced veterans, men who survived years in the mountains only to die in this unnecessary battle. And the aftermath, when people sober up and start asking questions, reveals a disturbing truth. Many trappers fought while dangerously intoxicated, made reckless decisions that cost lives, charged when they should have waited, exposed themselves when they should have taken cover. Liquid courage enabled the battle's ferocity, sure, but alcohol-impaired judgment turned it into needless slaughter. That battle encapsulates everything, and I mean everything defining peak mountain man culture. These men accomplish extraordinary feats requiring courage and skill beyond normal human capacity. They survive impossible odds. They adapt to environments that would kill ordinary people in days. They demonstrate toughness we can barely comprehend, and yet simultaneously at the exact same time, they destroy themselves through reckless addiction. They survive grisly attacks, then nearly die in drunken brawls with each other. They demonstrate superhuman endurance crossing unmapped mountain ranges, then lose entire fortunes at gambling tables while too drunk to stand. The contradiction isn't just present, it's fundamental. It defines who they are. Let me paint you a picture of the daily cycle during summer rendezvous, because this pattern repeats at every gathering, for every trapper, with minor variations. A trapper wakes up in his camp, his head is pounding, throbbing. The hangover from last night's drinking makes him wish he was dead. He's spent, let's say, 30 beaver pelts on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling losses. 30 pelts representing weeks of brutal labor, standing waist-deep in freezing streams, fingers numb, body aching, constant vigilance against predators and enemies. Gone. All of it. In one night. He swears, and this is important, he swears this day will be different. He'll trade carefully, preserve some wealth, maybe just buy supplies and nothing else. No drinking, no gambling. He'll be smart this time. But the sun climbs higher. The day heats up. Other trappers gather. They're passing bottles, laughing, telling stories about last season's close calls and triumphs. The social pressure builds. The isolation of mountain life makes human contact intoxicating even without alcohol. Someone offers him a bottle. Just one drink. To take the edge off the hangover. The whiskey burns going down, but it works. The pounding in his head recedes. The nausea settles. He feels almost human again. Someone proposes a shooting contest. Money on the line. And here's where pride enters. He's a mountain man, one of the best shots in the Rockies. His pride won't let him decline. Won't let him admit weakness or fear of losing money he doesn't have. He drinks a bit more. For steady hands, he tells himself. Focuses. Takes his shot. Misses. The other man wins. Now our trapper is deeper in debt, frustrated, angry at himself, and increasingly intoxicated. Evening arrives. Someone produces fiddles and drums. Music fills the valley. Native dancers perform traditional dances. White trappers attempt clog dancing in buckskin, looking ridiculous but not caring. The bottles circulate freely. Stories grow more exaggerated. Laughter grows louder. The trapper who swore abstinence this morning, he's deep in celebration now, singing songs he half remembers from childhood, gambling with pelts he hasn't earned yet, making promises about next year's labor to cover mounting debts, and he'll wake up tomorrow morning with another pounding headache, deeper in debt, swearing again that today will be different. This pattern repeats for weeks, until the rendezvous breaks up, until supply, caravans head back to Street Louis, and trappers head back into the mountains. And when they leave, most trappers stumble back into wilderness, owing more than they earned, contractually bound to fur companies for another year of service, carrying enough supplies for immediate needs but little else. Their entire year's brutal work evaporated in weeks of drunken celebration they can barely remember. The fur companies watch this with satisfaction. William Sublett, Bill Williams, and others running supply caravans calculate profits exceeding 300% on invested capital. The markup on alcohol alone generates wealth that makes them rich men by any standard. They've perfected the system. Isolated trappers work desperately for months, produce valuable pelts, then trade everything for overpriced goods, with significant portions going to alcohol that ensures continued dependency and poor decision-making. It's brilliant. It's brutal. It's working exactly as designed. But the system doesn't just devastate trappers. It devastates Native American communities even more completely. Traditional Native societies use alcohol minimally, ceremonially, controlled by strict social protocols. Elders decide when, where, and how much. The community monitors consumption, prevents excess. These protocols evolved over generations to prevent exactly the kind of destruction that's about to happen. But unrestricted access to strong alcohol at rendezvous shatters these protections. Native men encounter whiskey and rum without cultural frameworks for managing it. Traders deliberately encourage consumption to facilitate exploitative exchanges. Get them drunk, trade for more than the goods are worth, profit. Alcoholism spreads through tribes near trading posts and rendezvous sites. Native men spend tribal resources on whiskey instead of useful goods. Guns, blankets, tools, the things their families need, gone, traded for temporary intoxication. Alcohol-fueled violence erupts within tribes. Drunk men beat wives and children. Traditional taboos break down. Women bear children by white trappers who disappear next season, leaving mixed-race children who belong fully to neither world. Traditional leadership structures erode. Younger warriors chase prestige and goods available through fur trade relationships rather than following elder guidance. The elders watch their authority crumble as younger men pursue wealth and status through relationships with white traders who don't respect traditional ways. Some tribes experience near total social collapse. Communities that functioned for centuries suddenly can't maintain basic social order, can't make good decisions, can't protect themselves. All because of this introduced substance combined with deliberate exploitation. The Blackfoot Confederacy, Blackfeet, Blood, and Piegan peoples recognize these dangers. They watch what happens to tribes trading extensively with Americans. They see the alcoholism, the social dysfunction, the loss of autonomy, and they make a strategic decision: resist. They largely refuse sustained trading relationships with American fur companies. They prefer British traders to the north who maintain somewhat stricter alcohol policies. Not great policies, the British use alcohol too, but marginally better, less deliberately destructive. This resistance makes the Blackfoot targets. Trappers demonize them as uniquely hostile, savage, unreasonable. But the Blackfoot aren't irrational. They're defending their territory and resisting exploitation. They correctly recognize that American fur companies represent existential threats to their way of life. The resulting conflict claims hundreds of lives throughout the 1830s. Trappers die in ambushes. Blackfoot warriors die in retaliatory raids. The cycle of violence feeds itself, and alcohol fuels much of it. Drunk trappers making bad decisions, attacking when they should negotiate, escalating conflicts unnecessarily. Let me tell you about Old Bill Williams, because Williams represents mountain man culture at its most extreme, its most successful, and its most damaged. Williams arrives in the mountains, already a hard drinker, and he becomes legendary, genuinely legendary for his capacity to consume alcohol without apparent effect. He can drink amounts that would kill normal men and still function, still trap, still navigate, still survive. And he's one of the best trappers operating, knows beaver habits better than almost anyone, understands mountain geography like he was born there, can find productive streams when others find nothing. But Williams also embodies what isolation and extremity do to the human mind. He spends months entirely alone, talking to himself, talking to his horse and pack animals like they're people, developing elaborate conversations with creatures that can't respond. He develops peculiar religious beliefs, mixing Christianity with native spirituality with his own visions and revelations. He's convinced he'll be reincarnated as an elk after death. Completely convinced. Makes plans based on this belief. At rendezvous, Williams drinks solidly for weeks, fights frequently. His behavior becomes increasingly erratic. He's recognizable as human, sure, but barely. The isolation, the danger, the alcohol, they've created something strange, something that exists at civilization's edge. Williams represents what the mountains can do to a mind already prone to extremes. Take someone who's a bit unusual to begin with, subject them to years of isolation and danger and substance abuse, and they transform into something we don't have good words for. Not quite crazy, not quite sane, something else. Now let me tell you about Hugh Glass, because Glass's story is probably the most famous mountain man tale ever told, and it's famous for good reason. 1823. Glass is travelling with his party along the Grand River when a grizzly bear attacks him, and this isn't a close call, where the bear swipes at him and runs off. The bear mauls Glass, tears his throat, rips his back open. The wounds are so severe that his companions, experienced mountain men who've seen plenty of death, expect him to die within hours, maybe minutes. They dig a grave, stay briefly, wait for Glass to die so they can bury him and move on. Except Glass doesn't die fast enough. They have to keep moving. Staying means risking their own deaths. So they make a decision. They abandon Glass. Leave him to die alone. Glass regains consciousness, alone, severely wounded, 200 miles from the nearest fort, Fort Kiowa, 200 miles, and he starts crawling. Think about that. Really think about it. Crawling 200 miles through wilderness, his throat torn, his back shredded, wounds festering, infected, in constant pain we can't imagine, surviving on berries and carrion, maggots cleaning his wounds. That's not metaphor, that's what happened. The maggots ate the dead flesh and probably saved his life. For weeks, Glass drags his shattered body toward Fort Kiowa by sheer will, sheer refusal to die. And somehow, he reaches the fort alive. His survival is so improbable it enters legend immediately. People can't believe it, won't believe it. But it happened. Glass did it. But here's the detail that matters. The detail that rarely gets emphasized when people tell this story. Glass returns to trapping, continues the brutal cycle, and in 1833, 10 years after his legendary survival, Arikara warriors kill him on the Yellowstone River. His legendary toughness couldn't save him from the violent system he inhabited, and between his survival and his death, Glass drank heavily at Rendezvous like everyone else. Because that's what you do in this culture. That's how you cope with trauma we don't have other treatments for. The alcohol is medicine for nightmares, for memories, for psychological wounds that won't heal. Glass survived the impossible, crawled 200 miles with mortal wounds, returned to the mountains, and ultimately died anyway in the same violent system that nearly killed him before. That's the mountain man story in miniature. Extraordinary toughness, remarkable survival, but trapped in a system that destroys everyone eventually, even the legends. 1837. If you're a mountain man in 1837, you wake up one morning and realize something's wrong, fundamentally wrong. You check your trap lines, the lines you've been running for years, the streams that always produced, and you find nothing. Empty traps, no beaver. You move to another stream, another valley. Same result. The beaver are vanishing. Now here's the thing that's hard to grasp from our modern perspective, with our understanding of ecological collapse and resource depletion. These men don't have that framework. They don't think in terms of, we've over-harvested the population beyond sustainable levels. They just know the beaver aren't there anymore. Streams that teemed with colonies, hundreds of beaver-building dams, raising families now hold maybe a dozen, maybe none. The decades of relentless harvesting have done exactly what you'd expect, devastated the population beyond its capacity to recover. Spring season, fall season, hundreds of trappers, tens of thousands of pelts annually, year after year after year. The mathematics were always going to catch up eventually, and in 1837 they do. But the beaver population collapse? That's only half the catastrophe. The other half arrives from across the Atlantic Ocean, from European fashion houses that mountain men have never seen and never will. Silk hats become fashionable. That's it. That's the death blow. Gentlemen in London and Paris and Vienna decide with the bewildering speed that fashion moves that silk hats represent the height of style. Beaver felt suddenly seems old-fashioned, provincial, something your grandfather wore. Demand collapses almost overnight, and I mean overnight. Fur companies watch their warehouses full of pelts. Pelts worth fortunes last year become nearly worthless. A pelt that commanded $5 to $6 in street Louis now struggles to fetch $2, maybe less. Think about what this means. The entire economic foundation of Mountain Man existence. 15 years of infrastructure, established routes, supply networks, credit systems, disintegrates. Not gradually. Just gone. And then, because 1837 apparently isn't catastrophic enough, financial panic crashes through the American economy like a tidal wave. Banks fail. Credit evaporates. Companies that seemed solid collapse within weeks. The fur companies, already struggling with falling demand and depleted beaver populations, face losses that would bankrupt most businesses. They begin strategic withdrawal, cutting costs, abandoning infrastructure they built over decades. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company collapses entirely, just ceases to exist. The American Fur Company, John Jacob Astor's empire, pivots away from mountain operations toward buffalo robe trade on the Great Plains. Different product, different territory, different workers. The mountain men? They're expendable. Always were. The companies just needed them to keep believing otherwise. For trappers scattered across the Rockies, the collapse arrives as apocalyptic revelation. These are men who sacrificed everything for mountain wealth. Health? Gone, their bodies are broken by brutal labor and injuries. Relationships? Destroyed, most have no family ties remaining back east. Civilized comfort? Abandoned years ago for buckskin and snow caves. And now the promise that justified all that sacrifice, the promise of eventual wealth, evaporates like morning mist. A trapper who can survive 40 below zero winters, navigate unmapped wilderness, and harvest beaver with extraordinary efficiency discovers these abilities mean nothing when markets vanish. Zero. His hyper-specialized skills, developed through years of brutal experience, become obsolete overnight. The 1838 rendezvous at Wind River holds maybe 300 trappers, half the previous year's attendance, and the mood isn't festive, it's bitter, desperate, like a funeral where everyone's still breathing but knows they're already dead. Fur company agents offer insulting prices for pelts. They know trappers have no alternatives, no competing buyers, no other options. Supply prices remain inflated even as pelt values plummet. The economic vice tightens from both directions. Men arrive hoping to trade their year's work for stake money, for enough resources to start new lives, doing something else. Instead, they accumulate deeper debts. The system that exploited them during good times doesn't suddenly become generous during collapse. It squeezes harder, and the whiskey flows heavier than ever. Think about the psychology here. You've just realized your entire way of life is ending. The skills you developed? Worthless. The sacrifices you made? Meaningless. The future you imagined? Vanished. What do you do with that realization? How do you process that level of loss? You drink. Desperate men drink to forget collapsing dreams, to postpone dealing with impossible questions about what comes next. The violence escalates accordingly. Knife fights over trivial insults, because when your entire identity is crumbling, every slight becomes existential. Drunken shootings over card games, because what's money matter anyway when there's no future? Brutal beatings over perceived disrespect, because respect might be the only thing left. The rendezvous feels less like celebration and more like a wake for a culture dying in real time. Trappers get blackout drunk and wake owing more than they can repay. They sign contracts for next season because the alternative means admitting total defeat, means facing the reality that they're broke, broken, and obsolete. Some trappers recognize reality and adapt. Let me be clear about something. The ones who adapt successfully share specific characteristics. They're not necessarily the toughest or most skilled trappers. They're the ones with moderate drinking habits, the ones with native wives providing social connections and cultural bridges, the ones psychologically flexible enough to embrace change. Thomas Fitzpatrick, broken hand, transitions into guiding immigrant wagon trains westward. His wilderness knowledge proves valuable to Oregon Trail emigrants paying for experienced guides who can get them across the Rockies without dying. Fitzpatrick knows the passes, knows where water is, knows which native tribes might be friendly or hostile. That knowledge has market value even when beaver trapping doesn't. Kit Carson follows a similar path, becomes a military scout and guide. His tracking skills and tribal relationships prove useful for army expeditions. Carson speaks multiple native languages, understands native tactics and thinking. The army needs that expertise as American expansion accelerates. Joe Meek heads to Oregon Territory and becomes prominent in provisional government formation, uses his mountain man connections to build political influence in a region desperate for American leadership. These are the success stories, the ones who adapt, but here's what you need to understand. They're the minority, the exceptions that prove the rule. Most trappers can't adapt, and it's not because they lack courage or toughness. It's because they spent decades developing hyper-specialized skills for opportunities that no longer exist. And many, probably most, carry severe alcoholism developed during rendezvous culture. A functional alcoholic can trap alone for months, can maintain the discipline needed to check trap lines daily, process pelts, survive in isolation. The structure of trapping the routine, the solitude accommodates alcoholism remarkably well. But guiding emigrant families, working in military structures, those require reliability, sobriety, the ability to show up consistently, perform duties on schedule, interact with people who expect professional conduct. Alcoholics, even functional ones, struggle with these requirements. So the very drinking that helped trappers survive mountain isolation now makes them unemployable in occupations where their wilderness knowledge should provide advantage. The system that created their alcoholism now punishes them for having it. Fort Laramie, Fort Bridger, Bent's Fort. These trading posts become gathering places for displaced trappers, men without purpose or prospects. The forts offer occasional work repairing equipment, hunting meat for fort consumption, translating during tribal negotiations, and endless opportunities for drinking. Former mountain men loiter around forts trading stories of better days while consuming cheap whiskey. The stories grow more exaggerated with each telling and each bottle. The grizzly that attacked them gets bigger. The distance they traveled gets longer. The storms they survived get colder. Memory and myth blur together until they can't distinguish truth from fiction themselves. They're pitiful figures when you see them objectively. Men who once roamed freely across mountain ranges, who survived impossible conditions, who knew more about wilderness than any living Americans, now reduced to begging for drinks and sleeping in fort outbuildings. Jim Bridger represents something more complex. He demonstrates both successful adaptation and alcohol's persistent grip. Because adaptation isn't simple. It's not binary succeed or fail. It's messy, complicated. Bridger establishes Fort Bridger on the Oregon Trail. Smart positioning. The fort becomes a prosperous trading post and way station for emigrants heading west. Bridger marries multiple native women sequentially as widowhood and cultural custom dictate. Maintains important tribal relationships that facilitate trade. He becomes wealthy by mountain man standards, genuinely wealthy. But Bridger drinks heavily throughout these years. His successful business coexists with problematic alcohol consumption. He functions, even thrives, while carrying addiction that would destroy lesser men. See, Bridger represents the upper limit of mountain man adaptation. He changes careers successfully, builds new life, creates wealth, but he never escapes the culture that formed him, never escapes the bottle. The alcohol remains his constant companion from teenage years through old age. 60 years of drinking that somehow doesn't kill him, but it shapes everything, limits everything, colors every relationship and every achievement. The 1843 rendezvous at Fort Bridger proves to be the last significant gathering. Maybe 200 trappers attend. Down from 800 at the peak, the mood is elegiac. Everyone knows this era is ending, even if they won't say it aloud. And then here's the detail that crystallizes everything. No supply caravan arrives from Street Louis. The fur companies have abandoned the practice entirely. Just stopped. No announcement. No explanation. They made a business decision in distant offices, and that decision means the rendezvous system simply ends. Trappers trade among themselves, barter with Bridger's fort, but the old pattern is broken. The ritual that defined mountain man culture for 18 years doesn't end with dramatic finale. No last hurrah, no climactic final gathering. It just stops. Exhausted whimper. Many trappers disappear into obscurity during these years. They drift to frontier settlements, Taos, Santa Fe, Street, Louis, and vanish into death records. Died of unknown causes, the records state. But contemporaries understand those causes: liver failure, delirium tremens, alcohol withdrawal complications, drunken accidents, violence during intoxicated confrontations. The paperwork doesn't say, died of alcoholism, because that's not how frontier record-keeping works. But everyone knows. Everyone understands what unknown causes actually means when applied to a former mountain man in his 40s. Old Bill Williams continues trapping into the 1840s despite collapsing markets. His behavior grows increasingly erratic. He talks to his horse as though conducting complex theological debates, lengthy conversations where he argues points of doctrine with an animal that can't comprehend language. He develops conspiracy theories. The fur companies are plotting against him specifically. Native tribes are following him. Enemies lurk everywhere. His drinking reaches legendary proportions even by mountain man standards. And remember, these are men legendary for drinking. In 1849, Utes kill Williams in Colorado while he's scouting for army expeditions. He's drunk, isolated, increasingly detached from reality. The man who survived decades in the mountains, who knew wilderness better than almost anyone, dies because alcohol and isolation have destroyed his judgment. The California gold rush of 1849 pulls surviving trappers westward. They're hoping for one more frontier boom, one more chance to salvage ruined lives. Men who chased beaver pelts now chase gold. Some find modest success. Most find that California's mining camps offer unlimited alcohol at reasonable prices. They're recreating rendezvous drinking culture in Sierra Nevada goldfields. Same pattern, same problems, different location. They drift from claim to claim, spend any gold they find on whiskey, eventually die broke and drunk far from the mountains that once defined their existence. Die among strangers who don't know their stories, don't care about their past accomplishments. See only pathetic drunks taking up space. The machine has broken down. The system that exploited mountain men so efficiently for decades has moved on to new opportunities, new territories, new workers to exploit. And the men it used up, they're scattered across the West like debris after a storm, broken, obsolete, forgotten. The shadows are falling, and for most mountain men, those shadows will never lift again. The 1850s. If you're a surviving mountain man in the 1850s, you're in your 40s or 50s, and by frontier standards, that makes you elderly, ancient. You've got maybe a decade left if you're lucky. Most won't get that. These men are scattered across the West like debris after a storm. No country, no purpose. Their specialized skills obsolete. their bodies broken by decades of brutal labor and alcohol abuse. They carry injuries and diseases that would kill ordinary men. But here's the thing, they're not ordinary men. They're survivors who endured what shouldn't be survivable. And now they're facing the cruelest challenge of all, ordinary life. Let me tell you about Kit Carson, because Carson's trajectory illustrates both successful adaptation and the persistent shadow of alcohol. And it matters because Carson becomes the most famous mountain man through dime novel romanticization. His name becomes synonymous with frontier adventure. Except the real Carson bears almost no resemblance to his fictional counterpart. Carson serves as guide for John Fremont's expeditions. Multiple expeditions mapping the West, establishing American territorial claims, creating the geographical knowledge that makes Western expansion possible. Carson's tracking skills, his wilderness knowledge, his ability to read terrain, all of it proves invaluable. He marries Josefa Jaramillo. She's from a prominent Taos family, Hispanic, well connected in New Mexico's Spanish-speaking community. This marriage creates social connections Carson never had as a mountain man, gives him roots, respectability, a place in civilized society. During the Mexican-American War and subsequent Indian Wars, Carson serves as Army Scout, earns lieutenant colonel rank, participates in campaigns against Navajos and Apaches, implementing devastating scorched earth tactics. The long walk of the Navajo, forcing thousands from their homeland to Bosque Redondo, happens partly under Carson's guidance. He performs these duties effectively, competently. The Army values his expertise, pays him, promotes him. From outside appearances, Carson has successfully transitioned from obsolete mountain man to valued military asset. But Carson drinks heavily throughout these decades. Heavily. His wife Josefa manages household affairs while Carson cycles through periods of sobriety and relapse. When he's sober, Carson is capable, competent, reliable, does his job well, maintains relationships, functions in civilized society. When he's drinking, he becomes someone else, angry, unreliable, haunted by things he won't discuss, disappears on multi-day binges, returns home ashamed, promising change, then repeats the cycle. Josefa holds the family together, raises their children, manages finances, presents respectable face to community while privately dealing with husband's alcoholism. It's a pattern repeated in countless frontier households, the wife maintaining normalcy while husband self-destructs slowly. In 1868, Josefa dies shortly after childbearing complications. She's only 41 years old, and Carson, devastated, guilty, overwhelmed, drinks himself into oblivion, completely into oblivion. He's not even trying to function anymore, just drinking continuously. He dies weeks later, not yet 60 years old. Official records cite heart failure, which is technically true, his heart fails. But contemporaries understand the real cause: accumulated trauma, physical deterioration, and alcohol-related organ damage that finally exceeded even his legendary toughness. Carson's body just gives up. After decades of abuse, environmental exposure, injuries, malnutrition, alcohol, it reaches a point where it can't continue. The machine breaks down completely. And here's what haunts me about Carson. He's one of the success stories. He adapted, built new life, achieved fame and respect, earned steady income, had a family. By mountain man standards, Carson succeeded spectacularly. But success didn't equal sobriety, didn't equal peace, didn't equal escape from the culture and trauma that formed him. He carried that weight until it killed him. Now let me tell you about Jim Beckwourth, because Beckwourth follows a different path into decline. He continues moving between white and native worlds through the 1850s, sometimes living in Crow villages as a chief genuine leadership position, not honorary title, sometimes appearing in frontier towns, selling stories and spending money on whiskey. In 1851, Beckwourth dictates his autobiography to writer Thomas D. Bonner. The book that results is wildly exaggerated, outrageously exaggerated. Beckwourth claims exploits that probably never happened, inflates his importance, invents adventures from whole cloth, but it's entertaining. God, it's entertaining. And it captures something real about peak mountain man culture, the swagger, the violence, the cultural fluidity, the sense that normal rules don't apply. The book makes Beckwourth briefly famous. People want to meet him, hear his stories, touch someone who lived that legendary life. Except the fame doesn't generate lasting income. Publishers make money, Bonner makes money. Beckwourth gets a lump sum that vanishes quickly, spent on alcohol and generosity to friends who appear when he's buying drinks and disappear when he's broke. By 1860, Beckwourth operates a trading post in Colorado, serving both white emigrants and native peoples. Trying to use his cultural connections, his ability to move between worlds to build sustainable business. But his drinking worsens. He becomes unreliable, erratic, sometimes dangerous when intoxicated. Trading. Post customers learn they can't depend on him being sober, being rational, being the man he was versus the man alcohol makes him. In 1866, Beckwourth visits Crow peoples he once led, and he dies there under mysterious circumstances. Some sources claim natural causes, his body finally giving out after decades of abuse. Others whisper that the Crow poisoned him, that they wanted him to remain with them forever, even in death, wanted to prevent him from leaving again. More likely, Beckwourth's alcohol-ravaged body simply failed. Liver failure, heart failure, organ systems shutting down after decades of punishment. His death gets romanticized because romanticization is easier than confronting the banal tragedy of alcoholism. Let me talk about something that doesn't get discussed much: the mixed-race children of mountain men and native women. Because these children, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, navigate impossible positions. They inherit two worlds but belong fully to neither. Some integrate into native societies, becoming tribal members who happen to have white fathers. Fathers who often abandon them after brief relationships. Fathers they might never meet. Fathers who might not even know they exist. Others cluster around frontier forts and trading posts, occupying middle ground. They become translators, guides, cultural intermediaries, using their mixed heritage as economic asset when they can, hiding it when they can't. Their existence exposes fundamental exploitation underlying mountain man relationships with native women. Most trappers took native wives for convenience, companionship during winter isolation, cultural access to tribes, sexual partnership, economic alliance through marriage. When circumstances changed, when markets collapsed, when they decided to return east, when they found civilized wives, most trappers departed, left their native families behind. Sometimes provided some support, usually didn't, just left. The children grow up with this abandonment, this rejection, too white for full acceptance in native communities, too native for white society, caught between worlds that both reject them to varying degrees. Some successfully navigate these challenges, build lives as cultural bridges, marry, raise families, pass along mixed heritage to another generation. Others struggle with inherited alcoholism because addiction runs in families, and these children inherit vulnerability from both sides, struggle with cultural displacement that creates its own trauma and pain. Many die young. Disease, violence, alcoholism, accidents. The historical record rarely mentions them. They're footnotes in mountain man biographies, unnamed collateral damage in frontier conquest story. But they existed in significant numbers, and their experiences matter when calculating the full cost of mountain man culture. The 1860s Indian Wars devastate surviving relationships between former trappers and native peoples. Men who once lived peacefully among tribes who married native women, who had native friends and in-laws, now watch those tribes face military campaigns aimed at confinement or extermination. Some former trappers guide army columns hunting their former friends, hunting their wives' relatives, their children's people. They justify this with various rationales. Just following orders, civilization is inevitable. Tribes brought this on themselves through resistance. But the psychological cost is enormous. You can see it in their drinking, in their behavior, in their inability to discuss certain topics. They're complicit in destruction of cultures that once accepted them, that saved their lives, that gave them families. Others try maintaining neutrality, staying out of conflicts, preserving relationships with both sides. This proves impossible in practice. You can't be neutral when one side is systematically destroying the other. Neutrality becomes a choice, and usually a choice favoring the side with more power. The complexity of these relationships defies easy categorization. The West isn't a simple story of cowboys versus Indians. Its tangled web of alliances, betrayals, mixed families, economic dependencies, and tragic choices where every option involves betraying someone. Jim Bridger continues operating Fort Bridger until 1853, when Mormons force him out. They claim the land for their expanding settlements. Bridger protests it's his fort, his business, his livelihood. Doesn't matter. Mormons have numbers and organization. Bridger has what? Some loyal employees? Some native connections? Not enough. He works as army guide during several campaigns. His geographic knowledge remains valuable, maybe more valuable than ever, as army operations expand across the West. Bridger knows the passes, knows water sources, knows terrain like he's memorized a map that exists only in his head. But Bridger's drinking never stops, never even slows. He marries a third native wife after his second dies, operates trading posts, guides expeditions, tells stories to anyone who'll listen, stories growing more elaborate with each telling. His eyesight fails slowly. Progressive deterioration. By the 1860s, Bridger is nearly blind. His legendary ability to read landscapes reduced to memory and hearing. He retires to Missouri in 1868, supported by government pension recognizing his army service. Lives comfortably by frontier standards, surrounded by relatives and admirers who want to hear stories from the mountain man era. He dies in 1881 at age 77, one of very few mountain men reaching old age, one of the tiny minority who survives long enough to see the 20th century approaching. But even in retirement, Bridger drinks steadily. Alcohol remains his constant companion, from teenage years until death. 60 years of drinking, 60 years. That it doesn't kill him is miraculous, that it shapes. Everything about his life is undeniable. Fort trading posts become last refuges for broken trappers unable to adapt. These men perform menial labor, cutting firewood, hauling water, repairing equipment in exchange for accommodation and alcohol. Not even payment, just accommodation and alcohol. That's what their lives have reduced to. Fort Laramie, Fort Hall, Bent's Fort. They all house populations of aging, alcoholic former trappers, men who once roamed freely across mountain ranges, who survived grisly attacks and mountain winters and native warfare, now reduced to begging for drinks and sleeping in outbuildings. They tell stories to anyone who'll listen. The grizzly gets bigger each time. The storm gets colder. The distance they traveled gets longer. They're not deliberately lying, they believe these stories by now. Memory and myth have merged completely. Younger fort residents, employees, emigrants passing through, soldiers see only pathetic drunks. They don't know these men's histories, don't care. Can't imagine that the stumbling alcoholic sleeping it off in the stable was once among the toughest men alive. The medical reality of chronic alcoholism kills many during these years. Cirrhosis of the liver, whiskey liver in frontier parlance, causes slow, painful deaths. The abdomen swells with fluid, skin turns yellow, mental confusion increases. Eventually the liver fails completely, and death arrives as relief from suffering. Delirium tremens strikes those attempting sobriety after decades of consumption. The withdrawal symptoms terrify even hardened frontiersmen. Hallucinations of snakes and demons, uncontrollable shaking, seizures, death in maybe 30% of severe cases. Many trappers learn they can't stop drinking even when they want to. Their bodies have become so dependent that abstinence equals death sentence. They're physically incapable of sobriety without medical intervention that doesn't exist on the frontier. Alcoholic dementia affects many survivors. Years of heavy drinking destroy brain tissue, cause progressive cognitive decline. Formerly sharp wilderness men, men who could navigate by stars, who remembered complex geography, who made calculated decisions about survival, become confused, forgetful, unable to care for themselves. They wander frontier towns muttering to themselves. Older residents recognize them as former trappers. Younger generations see only crazy drunks. Without family or institutional support, these men die alone. In alleys, in gullies, in cheap boarding houses where nobody checks on them until smell indicates death. A few trappers find redemption through religion. Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, a Jesuit missionary operating throughout the Rockies, ministers to native peoples and mountain men alike. Some trappers confronting mortality, facing wasted lives, seek spiritual comfort. They attend mission services, confess decades of sins, violence, exploitation, abandonment of families, sins against native peoples, sins against themselves. They attempt sobriety through faith, believing that if they can't stop drinking through willpower, maybe God can help. Success proves rare. Addiction and trauma run too deep for most, but a handful achieve lasting sobriety, spend final years in genuine peace, having found forgiveness for themselves and the brutal lives they led, having made peace with God and perhaps with themselves. These are the exceptions, the rare success stories. Most mountain men die drunk, broken, and alone. Die without redemption or peace. Die knowing they wasted their lives chasing dreams that were never real. The scattered remnant disperses further, dies off, fades into obscurity. Within a generation, most will be forgotten, their stories lost, their graves unmarked. They broke themselves on the mountains, and the mountains remain unchanged, indifferent to human tragedy, eternal and uncaring. Stop. Step back from individual stories for a moment. Let's look at the bigger picture. Because when you see the complete pattern, when you count the actual costs, the Mountain Man story becomes something very different from the legend. The Mountain Man era spans roughly 1820 to 1850, 30 years. During those 3 decades, approximately 3,000 men work as trappers in the Rocky Mountains. 3,000. By 1880, just 30 years after the era ends, maybe 300 survive. 300 out of 3,000. That's a 90% casualty rate. 90%. Let that sink in. We're talking about casualty rates that exceed most wars, exceed most epidemics. This isn't romantic adventure. It's systematic destruction of human lives on massive scale. So, where did they go? How did 2,700 men die? Combat accounts for surprisingly small percentage, and this matters because the legends emphasize combat. The grizzly bear attacks, the battles with native warriors, the dramatic violent deaths that make good stories. But actual battle deaths? Maybe a few hundred. Not thousands. Hundreds. Grizzly attacks, native conflicts, all the dramatic violence combined, it's not the primary killer. Not even close. Environmental exposure claims hundreds more. Hypothermia, drowning in spring floods, weather-related accidents, getting caught in blizzards, falling through ice. The mountains kill casually and constantly, but even environmental deaths don't account for the majority. Disease kills hundreds. Mountain fever, probably typhoid. Cholera sweeping through camps. Dysentery from contaminated water. These frontier diseases kill without drama, without witness. Men die alone in their camps, and nobody finds their bodies until spring thaw. Animal attacks, though dramatic and memorable, represent minor mortality cause. Maybe a few dozen deaths total from grizzlies, mountain lions, wolves. It happens, makes memorable stories, but it's statistical noise compared to the real killer. The largest killer by far, and I need you to really hear this, is alcohol and its cascading consequences. Liver disease alone claims maybe 800 to 1,000 mountain men, 800 to 1,000 deaths from organ failure caused by decades of heavy drinking. That's 1/3 of all mountain man deaths from a single cause, their livers giving out. Add alcohol-related violence, drunken shootings, stabbings during intoxicated arguments, beatings that go too far, men killing each other over perceived insults that sober men would ignore. Add several hundred more deaths. Include accidents while intoxicated, drowning in streams while drunk, falling from horses, freezing to death after passing out outdoors in winter, accidental shootings. Add several hundred more. Alcohol doesn't just kill directly. It impairs judgment, creates vulnerability, causes accidents that wouldn't happen sober. When you calculate alcohol's total contribution to mountain man mortality, you're looking at maybe half of all deaths. Half. More mountain men died from alcohol and its consequences than from grizzly bears, native warfare, and environmental exposure combined. The numbers tell a story the legends omit completely. A typical mountain man career lasts 7 to 10 years before death or disability forces retirement. 7 to 10 years, that's it. And the few who reach their 40s carry visible damage. Missing fingers and toes from frostbite, scarred faces from bear attacks and knife fights, bent backs from decades of physical labor, yellowish skin indicating liver failure. Most weigh significantly less than when they arrived. Chronic malnutrition and parasites waste their bodies despite eating enormous quantities when food is available. They look old, ancient, worn down in ways that make them appear 20 years older than their actual age. Now let's talk about the economic calculation, because when you run the numbers, the exploitation becomes undeniable. Take an average trapper who works 8 years before dying or quitting. Each year he harvests approximately 80 pelts worth, maybe $300 to $400 in trade goods at Rendezvous. Over 8 years, that's $2,400 to $3,200 total earnings. Sounds decent, right? Until you remember those are Rendezvous prices. The actual value what those same goods cost in Street Louis equals maybe $800 to $1,000. So immediately, just through price inflation, 2/3 of the trapper's earnings vanish. 2/3. From that remaining third, subtract alcohol purchases. At most Rendezvous gatherings, trappers spend 40 to 60% of their earnings on alcohol. 40 to 60%. The companies deliberately encourage this through availability, social pressure, and the addictive nature of their product. Run the final accounting. An average mountain man earns maybe $400 to $600 in actual value over 8 years of work. $400 to $600 total. That's $50 to $75 annually. A farm laborer in Missouri earns $60 to $80 per year, with housing and meals included, facing virtually no mortality risk, working in sight of family and community, with possibility of eventually owning land. The mountain man trades his life, his health, and his future for barely more than he'd earned safely ploughing fields. The only ones getting rich are fur company owners and street Louis merchants selling overpriced goods to trapped labor, and the fur companies understood this perfectly. We have their internal correspondence, their account books. The evidence is damning. William Sublette writes to partners, "The Indians and trappers will pay any price for whiskey. We should dilute it further and raise prices." Direct quote. They're discussing how to maximize profits from addiction. Another letter coldly calculates, if a man earns $400 in pelts and spends half on whiskey at our prices, we profit $200 from his alcohol sales alone. They're viewing trappers not as employees, not as human beings, but as resources to extract maximum value from before inevitable death or disability. The alcohol itself grows progressively worse in quality. Early Rendezvous featured genuine whiskey and rum, actual products you might drink in Street Louis or New York without dying. By the late 1830s, companies ship raw grain alcohol, dilute it with river water at ratios of 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part alcohol, add tobacco for color and bite, throw in red pepper for burn, sell it as whiskey. This toxic mixture causes enormous health damage beyond normal alcohol. We're talking about contaminants, impurities, additives that poison. Trappers drinking this concoction destroy their livers faster, damage their brains more severely, die younger, and they think they're consuming legitimate spirits. They don't know they're being poisoned deliberately to maximize company profits. Trading Post ledgers reveal another damning pattern. Perpetual debt. Here's how it works. A trapper arrives at Autumn Rendezvous owing $50 from previous year. He trades $100 worth of pelts a good season. By any reasonable accounting, he should now have $50 credit. He should be able to buy supplies and have money left over. Instead, the account shows him owing $25. How? The company charged him for winter supplies he never received, added interest on previous debt interest he didn't know he owed, applied complex accounting that somehow always leaves trappers owing more. The trapper protests, says he never received those supplies, says he doesn't owe that interest. Doesn't matter. The company keeps the books, the company sets the terms. The company has leverage because the trapper needs next year's supplies to survive. Needs traps, ammunition, basic goods. Can't get them anywhere else. So, he signs another contract, accepts another year of debt bondage, because the alternative is dying in the mountains without supplies, or admitting total defeat and returning to civilization broke and broken. This system mirrors plantation slavery's debt peonage, mirrors company town exploitation of later industrial workers. The parallel isn't coincidental, it's the same fundamental structure. Workers produce value for owners while kept perpetually indebted through controlled purchasing systems and manipulated accounting. The difference is, mountain men entered this system voluntarily. Though whether choices made by desperate, uneducated young men constitute truly voluntary participation, and that's debatable, the impact on Native American communities proves equally devastating. Maybe more devastating because Native peoples didn't choose to encounter this system. It invaded their lands and destroyed their cultures. Tribes trading at rendezvous and forts encounter unregulated alcohol access without cultural frameworks for managing it. Traditional Native societies use alcohol ceremonially and sparingly. Strict social protocols control consumption. Elders decide when, where, how much. The community monitors individuals, prevents excess. These protocols evolved over generations to prevent exactly the destruction that's about to happen. Unrestricted access shatters these protections. Native men encounter whiskey and rum without cultural safeguards. Traders deliberately encourage consumption to facilitate exploitative exchanges, get them drunk, trade for more than goods are worth, profit. Alcoholism spreads through tribes near trading posts like disease. Native men spend tribal resources on whiskey instead of necessities. Guns for hunting, blankets for winter, tools for daily life, gone, traded for temporary intoxication. Drunk men beat wives and children. Traditional taboos against domestic violence break down. Women bear children by white trappers who disappear next. Season. Mixed-race children grow up without fathers, without full acceptance in either culture. Traditional leadership structures erode. Younger warriors chase prestige and goods available through fur trade relationships rather than following elder guidance. The elders watch their authority crumble as young men pursue wealth and status through associations with traders who don't respect traditional ways. Some tribes experience near-total social collapse. Communities that functioned for centuries suddenly can't maintain basic social order, can't make good decisions, can't protect themselves or their territories, all because of introduced substance combined with deliberate exploitation. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples of the upper Missouri River region experience catastrophic decline during these decades. Smallpox epidemics kill thousands in 1837 disease brought by white contact. Survivors cluster near trading posts, increasingly dependent on external trade for survival. Alcohol flows freely at these posts. Within 2 decades, populations drop from thousands to hundreds. While disease causes most deaths directly, alcohol accelerates the collapse, prevents effective response to crisis, creates new forms of social dysfunction that compound existing problems. The Blackfoot Confederacy's resistance to American traders partly stems from witnessing this destruction. Blackfoot leaders observe what happens to tribes trading extensively with Americans. They see the alcoholism, the social breakdown, the loss of autonomy. They choose warfare over trade, view American fur companies as existential threats rather than economic opportunities. History often portrays Blackfoot hostility as irrational aggression, savage resistance to civilized progress. In reality, it's strategic defense against forces they correctly recognize as destructive. The Blackfoot are defending their way of life against invasion disguised as trade, and they're not wrong about the threat. The children of mountain men and native women represent another tragic cost, rarely calculated in any reckoning. Hundreds, maybe thousands of mixed-race children grow up without fathers during this era. Some mountain men maintain genuine family relationships and support their children. These are the exceptions. Most trappers abandon native wives and children when circumstances change, move to new territories, return to civilization, find civilized wives, just leave. These abandoned children face discrimination in both white and native societies. Too white for full tribal acceptance. Too native for white society. They exist in margins, navigating impossible positions. Some successfully become translators, guides, cultural intermediaries, use their mixed heritage as economic asset. Others struggle with inherited alcoholism, genetic vulnerability combined with traumatic childhoods. Many die young from disease, violence, accidents, alcoholism. The historical record rarely mentions them. They're footnotes in mountain man biographies, unnamed collateral damage in frontier conquest story, but they existed in significant numbers, and their experiences matter when calculating full cost of mountain man culture. The knowledge lost when trappers died drunk in frontier gutters represents another uncounted cost. These men possessed extraordinary wilderness wisdom, detailed geographical knowledge of unmapped territories, understanding of native languages and cultures, sophisticated environmental knowledge about animal behavior and plant uses, survival techniques refined through brutal experience, navigation skills allowing them to cross unmapped terrain without getting lost. When a mountain man died face down in a saloon, that knowledge vanished forever, irretrievably lost. A few trappers documented their expertise, Bridges' geographical descriptions become crucial for later emigrants. Carson's trail reports guide army expeditions. Smith's journals preserve observations about Western territories. But most died without recording anything, without teaching younger generations, without preserving hard-won wisdom accumulated through years of experience. Their knowledge died with them, buried in forgotten graves or left to rot in frontier alleys. Think about the total accounting now. 2,700 dead out of 3,000. Most killed by alcohol and its consequences. Survivors broken, alcoholic, obsolete. Native communities devastated. Mixed-race children abandoned. Knowledge lost. And the only beneficiaries? Distant company owners and shareholders who never saw the mountains, never risked their lives, never suffered. The mountain man system was economically beneficial only for people who weren't mountain men. Everyone actually in the mountains got systematically exploited, used up, and discarded. That's the reckoning. That's the true cost. And it's a cost the legends never acknowledge. 1900. Turn of the century. The mountain men have been gone for half a century now. Most of the survivors are dead. The few remaining are ancient in their 70s or 80s, if they somehow lived that long. And the transformation is complete. The brutal reality has become romantic legend. Dime novels portray noble adventurers conquering wilderness through courage and skill, brave pioneers opening the West for American expansion, heroic individualists embodying frontier virtues. The alcoholism? Gone. The exploitation? Vanished. The tragedy? Erased. Replaced by sanitized adventure stories that bear almost no resemblance to what actually happened. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows tour eastern cities and European capitals. They feature mountain man characters performing for audiences who've never seen real wilderness. These theatrical mountain men are clean, sober, heroic figures performing choreographed wilderness feats. They shoot targets while riding horses, demonstrate trapping techniques, tell sanitized stories about surviving bear attacks. The audiences eat it up. They want frontier adventure without the uncomfortable parts, want heroism without acknowledging exploitation, want legends without confronting truth. And America gives them what they want. Because here's the thing, this mythologization serves purposes, important purposes for a nation trying to justify its expansion westward. America wants foundation myths portraying westward expansion as noble enterprise. Manifest Destiny needs heroes, needs pioneers blazing trails for civilization, needs to believe that conquering the continent represented progress rather than genocide and exploitation. The mountain men reimagined as pioneering heroes rather than exploited alcoholics fit this narrative perfectly. They discovered territories, blazed trails, mapped unknown regions, facilitated American expansion through their wilderness mastery. The fact that they died in droves from preventable causes while enriching distant capitalists, that becomes inconvenient detail best omitted. The fact that they introduced alcohol and disease to native communities, quietly forgotten. The fact that most were broken alcoholics who died in gutters, scrubbed from the record. Hollywood cinema eventually cements the sanitized version. Films from the 1920s onward portray mountain men as romantic figures. Jeremiah Johnson shows peaceful coexistence with wilderness. A Man Called Horse depicts cultural immersion in native society. Later, The Revenant presents Hugh Glass's survival as heroic triumph. These films show wilderness adventure. They show bear attacks dramatic and cinematic. They show conflicts with native peoples simplified into good guys versus bad guys. But they downplay or eliminate alcohol's central role. When drinking appears, it's portrayed as harmless celebration rather than devastating addiction. The films avoid extended sequences of trappers drinking themselves to death over years of rendezvous gatherings. Avoid showing systematic exploitation by fur companies. Avoid depicting the slow deterioration of men destroyed by alcoholism, because those realities aren't cinematic, aren't inspiring. Don't sell tickets. Yet the real legacy persists in less visible ways that matter even if they're not celebrated. The mountain men opened the West to American expansion. That's undeniable. They established routes and provided geographical knowledge that enabled later settlement. The Oregon Trail follows paths mountain men discovered. The California Trail uses passes they mapped. Emigrant guidebooks rely on information they provided. Without their wilderness exploration, American expansion westward would have proceeded more slowly, more tentatively, differently. The mountain men, despite being exploited themselves, facilitated expansion that devastated native peoples and transformed the continent. They also established patterns of boom-bust frontier capitalism that echo through American history. The fur trade structure workers taking enormous risks for modest wages, while owners capture massive profits. Isolation, preventing labor organization, the addiction used as control mechanism. This pattern reappears constantly. Gold rushes, timber camps, mining towns, oil booms, fishing fleets. The structure remains remarkably consistent. Workers isolated in extreme conditions, paid just enough to survive, kept dependent through debt and addiction. Owners extracting maximum value before moving to next opportunity. The mountain man experience becomes template for extractive frontier capitalism that defines American development for the next century. The drinking culture they established shapes the American West for generations. Frontier towns develop around saloons, multiple saloons per town, sometimes outnumbering all other businesses combined. Hard drinking becomes marker of masculine frontier identity. Cowboys, miners, loggers, railroad workers, they all inherit and perpetuate the culture of alcoholic release after periods of brutal isolated labor. Work hard for weeks or months in dangerous conditions. Descend on towns. Drink away earnings in days of celebration. Return to work broke and owing money. The mountain men didn't invent frontier drinking culture, but they refined it, exemplified it, demonstrated that this pattern could be systematized and exploited for profit. Later, industries learn from their example. Modern mountain man rendezvous gatherings occur throughout the West. Enthusiasts recreating 1830s frontier life through historical reenactment. They wear buckskin clothing, shoot muzzle-loading rifles, set up period-accurate camps, trade replica goods. These gatherings attract thousands of participants who genuinely appreciate the skills, independence, and adventure of the mountain man era. They're not being cynical or disrespectful. They admire what mountain men accomplished, want to preserve that knowledge and heritage. But here's what's interesting. The reenactments carefully avoid the alcoholism. Participants drink beer and whiskey socially, moderately, nothing approaching the suicidal binges defining actual rendezvous. They want the romance without the reality, the skills without the suffering, the adventure without the exploitation. And you know what? I don't blame them. Who wants to reenact systematic self-destruction? Who wants to role-play alcoholism and debt bondage? The reenactors preserve valuable skills, traditional crafts, wilderness knowledge, and historical understanding. That matters. But the sanitization reveals how uncomfortable we are with the full truth. The Native American perspective on mountain man legacy remains complex, often unheard, rarely centered in popular narratives about the frontier. Some tribes view the mountain man era as beginning of catastrophic disruption. The trappers arrived first, before soldiers, before emigrants, before reservations. They established trade relationships and introduced alcohol, created dependencies, disrupted traditional economies. Then came emigrants following trails the mountain men blazed. then soldiers enforcing American control of territories the mountain men mapped, then reservations confining peoples to fractions of their traditional lands. The mountain men weren't the primary cause of native dispossession, but they were the leading edge. The scouts for invasion that followed. Other tribal perspectives acknowledge positive individual relationships. Some mountain men married into tribes genuinely, became tribal members, fought alongside native warriors, earned respect through demonstrated character rather than exploitation. Jim Beckworth, among the Crow. Old Bill Williams among various tribes. Numerous lesser-known trappers who created authentic cross-cultural bonds. Their mixed-race descendants today represent living connections between cultures. These descendants navigate complex inheritances. They carry genes from both sides of a cultural collision, carry stories about ancestors who existed between worlds. Some embrace this heritage proudly. Others struggle with historical trauma passed through generations. The geographical features mountain men named persist on modern maps, permanent reminders of their presence. Bridger Mountains in Montana, Sublette County in Wyoming, Jackson Hole named after David Jackson, trapper and fur company partner, Coulter's Hell John, Coulter's name for Yellowstone's geothermal features, Beckworth, pass through the Sierra Nevada. These names embed mountain man legacy into landscape itself. Driving through the Rockies today, you're passing through territories these men explored, following roads that trace routes they discovered, crossing passes they named. Most travelers don't know the stories behind the names, don't realize they're following paths first traveled by alcoholic trappers 2 centuries ago. The environmental legacy proves mixed, complicated. Mountain men nearly hunted beaver to extinction in the Rockies, demonstrated early American capitalism's eagerness to destroy natural resources for short-term profit. The beaver populations crashed, didn't recover for decades. When recovery finally happened, it required legal protection and active management. The beaver came back, but only after government intervention preventing further exploitation. Without that intervention, North American beaver might have gone the way of passenger pigeons extinct through human greed. The mountain men's intensive trapping also disrupted entire riparian ecosystems. Beaver dams control water flow, prevent erosion, create wetlands, provide habitat for numerous species. When you remove beaver, you don't just lose one species, you transform entire landscapes. Streams that once meandered through meadows cut deeper channels. Wetlands drain. Willow and cottonwood stands die without beaver maintaining water levels. Fish populations decline. Bird species dependent on wetland habitat disappear. The ecological cascade continues for decades. We're still discovering ways that beaver removal affected Western ecosystems, still finding consequences we didn't anticipate. The mountain men couldn't have known this, they lacked the ecological understanding. But ignorance doesn't prevent damage. Yet mountain men also developed sophisticated environmental knowledge worth acknowledging. They understood animal behavior, seasonal patterns, weather forecasting from natural signs, edible and medicinal plants. Landscape ecology learned through direct observation and brutal experience. Modern wilderness survival experts often rediscover techniques mountain men used routinely: how to survive without modern equipment, how to navigate without GPS, how to find food and water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to predict weather changes before they arrive. That knowledge, preserved in fragmentary accounts and oral traditions, represents positive legacy, not sufficient to outweigh the damage, not nearly sufficient, but worth acknowledging nonetheless. The cautionary tale remains the most important legacy, and this is what we need to carry forward. What we need to remember. The mountain men's story demonstrates what happens when exploitative economic systems target vulnerable men with addictive substances and impossible dreams. It shows how capitalism without restraint treats human beings as disposable resources, numbers on ledgers, assets to be extracted and discarded. It reveals how addiction can destroy even the toughest individuals when embedded in systematic exploitation, how personal weakness becomes less important than structural forces, how individual choices matter less when the system is rigged. It exposes how societies romanticize and mythologize brutal realities rather than confronting uncomfortable truths, how we prefer convenient legends to complicated history, how we sanitize suffering to create entertainment. Walk into the mountains today, the Tetons, the Absarokas, the Wind River Range. The wilderness appears timeless and pristine, untouched by human activity, pure nature. But ghosts walk these valleys if you know where to look. The streams still flow where trappers once set trap lines, catching beaver that no longer exist in historical numbers. The meadows still green each spring where rendezvous gatherings once erupted in violent celebration. The forests still shelter clearings where desperate men drank themselves to oblivion, knowing their way of life was dying but unable to imagine alternatives. The mountains witnessed everything. They watched young men arrive, full of hope and ambition. Watched those same men transform into something barely human, surviving impossible conditions while destroying themselves with alcohol. Watched the final scattered survivors stumble away, broken and defeated, and the mountains remained unchanged, indifferent to human tragedy played out on their slopes. They don't care about our stories, don't preserve our memories, don't judge our choices. They simply exist, eternal, uncaring. The deadly truth about how mountain men got wasted isn't just about alcohol, though alcohol killed most of them. It's about how a society sent men into wilderness as expendable labor, provided them addictive substances to maximize exploitation, then abandoned them when markets shifted. It's about how the same society later transformed this tragedy into romantic legend, erased the suffering to create convenient myths, turned systematic exploitation into heroic adventure, made entertainment from trauma. The mountain men blazed trails, discovered passes, mapped territories, opened the West to American expansion. These accomplishments are real, historically significant, undeniable. But they paid for these accomplishments with their lives, health, and futures. They got wasted, both intoxicated and destroyed by a system that valued their labor but not their humanity. Their story isn't ultimately about heroic adventure. It's about exploitation, addiction, and the terrible price of chasing impossible dreams in a rigged game. The mountains remember what history prefers to forget. Every wind through the pines whispers their story. Every stream running cold and clear once felt trappers standing knee-deep, harvesting beaver for distant markets. Every alpine meadow once heard drunken singing and gunshots at rendezvous celebrations that masked desperation with false courage. The mountains keep their secrets. But for those willing to look past the legends, for those willing to confront uncomfortable truths, the story remains visible, written in forgotten graves, in abandoned campsites, in the ghosts of men who conquered wilderness, only to be conquered by themselves. That's the legacy. That's what remains. Not the sanitized legend, not the romantic adventure, but the truth about exploitation, addiction, and human cost of American expansion. The mountains don't lie. They don't romanticize. They don't create convenient myths. They simply stand as witnesses to what actually happened, and they'll remain long after we're all forgotten. Long after our stories fade. Long after the last person who remembers the mountain men has died. The mountains endure, indifferent, eternal, unchanged.